So my name is Tanner Allen. I am the Director of Baseball Performance with Proteus Motion, but I'm also the physical therapist and a strength and conditioning coach at Cressey Sports Performance in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. We've had a Proteus for a little over 2.5 years now, so I've had ample opportunity to kind of get up to speed with the capabilities of this machine, and then also have been a part of, helping build this machine out, as well as these performance tests. We'll dive into this. I would say at like a moderate level of complexity today, but we can obviously go in a little deeper. I know we're going to have people from all over that are joining that have Proteuses currently, and they're looking at, kind of seeing how we implement it at CSP, but as well as, gyms that are interested in having a Proteus. So I'm going to try to blend a lot of this together. And then anytime we have at the end, we'll branch out to more specifically any questions you guys have. All right, so a couple of the things that we're going to cover today is the terminology of the actual test and how, to interpret both the general and the Cressey's performance tests. And then some interpretations of example tests that we've captured here and how we would kind of work through some of those. And then some unique cases, things that you can kind of grasp and pick up from, and how you use the test on a day-to-day basis. Now, obviously, the more experience you have in front of the machine or using it and seeing kind of how the test spits out the input will, make your job as a coach a little easier to kind of pick up on these things. So the first thing we'll start out with is, why should you even be doing the power reports to begin with? Why can't you just use the standard functions on the machine, which would consist of freestyle or some workout modes? So the performance side of things are going to dive much deeper into capturing the data that as coaches we're interested in. And so my colleague last week or a few weeks ago gave a presentation on how you can create your own test at your specific facilities, Justin Maskell. So you can actually access that recording if interested. Also, we can even send that to this list if people are interested. But for the reasons as why we want to get these tests, we want to capture your baseline data. So, the ability to show improvements over a course of time. An example here at Cressey's is we're going to have an athlete come in. If we know he's going to be around for a couple of months and we know that he's adequate training ability, we're going to want to try to get a nice history table assessment, movement screening, and then we'll put them on Proteus to get these baseline measurements, so that at the end of the periodization phase, we'll actually want to compare that data to what he's done previously if he's coming off a long season, and then moving forward, showing progressions that he's had. In a lot of instances on my side of the coin as a physical therapist, we are going to have injuries that we're working through occasionally. So if we have baseline data that shows tracking of that injury or an area of the body that, an athlete might not be using as much, or we want to make sure that they're at an adequate level before we're pushing them in the gym or sports specific needs, we have something to at least reference back to. Next is going to be a comparisons data feature that we just added not too long ago on the software side of Proteus. So you have the ability to track that specific athlete against his age group norms and people very much similar to them, as well as their weight and sport specific positions, so on and so forth. So I got examples of showing how you can dive into that side of things. And then one of the big ones for a lot of facilities is justification on, the individualized training programs, or, making alterations to those programs. Many of times as a coach, you're, watching an athlete go through something and what your eyes are telling you, and you kind of fill in the blanks to the story. Well, with Proteus and the piece of the pie regarding power and some of the other metrics you can look at, you can now fill in those gaps, and you can reassure yourself as a coach what it is you think you're seeing, or, connect the dot that you might not once known was there. A good example of this is a lot of our young coaches and interns. They sit in on a lot of the evals that, Cressey does, or our other strength coaches. And they have an innate ability to kind of describe to the athlete like how they might perform in certain things in the gym or on the field. And you can then connect all the dots from the eval all the way up through like their first full day, capture their numbers on Proteus, and it connects the dots a lot more, as well as tracked out over time. So the learning curve can be kind of shortened for what you think you see with your eyes versus what you're actually, getting from an analytical and a collection data standpoint. And then return on investment. A lot of our sites will actually use the Power Report as a specific offshoot to create extra revenue because of the in-depth PDF Power Report that you'll get following the test. That could be printed, it could be emailed, so on and so forth, and it can be used as a separate entity in and of its own. So these are two examples of the Power Reports. Those of you that have your Proteus machines already and you're here to kind of learn a little bit more on it, we're definitely going to dive into like the nuances of how to break down the report and read it, which might be a little confusing for some new people, but at least you're exposing your eyes to it. The one on the left is the General Power Report, and the one on the right is the Cressey Power Report. Albeit they look fairly similar, there's some things in between that are going to be unique about the two tests. So the first thing we'll start out, this is going to be like a screen grab of like a quadrant of the PDF report. I'll show you a full example of one shortly. For right now, though, we'll just look at it piece by piece. So you'll see the heat map, or just a body diagram with the various color coding representations for the percentile rank down of power for those regions. You'll notice that red's your weakest or lowest power output, whereas the green is the most powerful. We actually just kind of revamped the color scale not too long ago to try to fit more with the industry standards from promoting an area of improvement versus a regression in specific areas. And you'll notice that there's roughly a 15% range between each of these. And you're probably wondering, that might be a little large, how would we know something a little bit more specific to the area of the body that we're wanting to look at with some people? So we then expand that screenshot out, and you'll see an example of two movements that show the gap between these 15%. So if we look at the left bicep, the 47th percentile here, and then we could correspond that obviously with the graph, we'll see that follows within that color. And then you look down at the actual diagram and you'll see the same thing replicates in that picture. Vice versa on the right, 22nd percent, they're going to fall within the orange, and we can see the orange on this side. So if you're ever working with a guy and you're just looking at the color coding side of things and you don't see a huge jump or a large drastic change in the colors, always going to reference, look at the percentile ranking for those movements on the side. And that's typically what I'll do. And I'll dive into some of these other things in a second. So what is the general power test? So it was a test that was designed to kind of encompass a little bit of everything that the general population would need to hit to have a full body report spit out to give them, information on where their weaknesses and strengths were. This was only looking at power at the time, and it consists of 17 different movements, dissecting the body into left to right, top to bottom, front to back, and unilateral and bilateral. So this screen grab over here to the side is going to break the body down into those 5 quadrants. You have your arms, your chest, your core, your legs, and your back. So the arms, for example, we're looking at a bicep curl and a tricep extension. This straight bar is going to represent the bilateral movement of those, whereas this horse-shaped crescent moon symbol is going to represent the unilateral. On this bilateral, we have on the left side is your power output in watts for your most powerful rep with that movement during the test. On the right, you're going to have your percentile ranking, which also corresponds with that color coding graph that we mentioned a moment ago. And then the Proteus score, that is your pound for pound weight, pound for pound power per the weight that you move. So 205 divided by whatever this athlete's body weight was gave them that 1.2 Proteus score for those. And you see that with each category. The unilateral, once again, you have your left and your right side, and this balance score. This is probably one of the more important scores that on the PT side of things that I look at. And I'll give some examples of how, Cressey or myself also look at these things later, because you're going to end up noticing over time that there's some imbalances as an athlete, whether you're baseball or, other various sports. You almost want to find some imbalances as long as they're within a safe range. Whereas like this right, 14% more powerful on this tricep extension, like that would be something that we would want to like dive into a little bit more. Moving along with the general power test, there's another quadrant that, encompasses a couple of other things. So we have a Proteus score, which is going to be the cumulative evaluation of power production for pound of body mass. So we saw that on each individual segment, but that's also going to be overall combining all those movements that we saw on that last page to give you kind of a gross understanding of where that athlete's pound for pound power ranks. For example, a smaller athlete doesn't necessarily have to move as much weight to get a high Proteus score, whereas a bigger athlete is sure as heck going to have to move a lot more to get, above that one. We have kind of an ideal range that we'd typically like to see our athletes in. Keep in mind, this is more of a general population test here at our facility. At the moment, we use the Cressey Performance test for our baseball players. But between 1 to 1.4. We then have the overall power balance, which looks at, left and right side only, like which side do you favor more? As you would imagine, your dominant side is likely going to be the side that you're having a little bit of shift. If I go back to that other screen real quick, I typically have the tipping point of these differences around 7%. If it's something under 7%, like I'm normally pretty good with it. If it's something over 7%, I'm going to want to know why, potentially, whether there's something in their history, what is their sport specific demands? Are they dealing with something? How did the actual reps even look? Did they perform the test accurately? So on and so forth. Back to this screen, we're looking at the intra-body power analysis, which is what these hemispheres and half circles with color coding look like. So you have a push to pull comparison, a lower to upper, and a unilateral to bilateral. This is something that I typically will look at it in the other section, but for some people, like they like to look at it here just because it spits it out, fairly quickly. So we're looking at that front to back push to pull, 2% stronger in the pull direction. So that rowing variation. Ideally, you would want to be stronger on that posterior side. However, you'll find some that trickle over into being stronger on the push. But, typically if it doesn't range too far out, then we're good with it. Like I said, I don't look at these too much unless I have a reason to look at it. Tricep extension, 14% stronger on that push side than the curl. As you would expect, the triceps are a bigger muscle group. They're going to produce more power. Same thing with the lower body, with that forward press compared to the vertical hop, and then a bilateral row to the vertical hop. This bottom section, we're looking at just the unilateral comparisons of an upper push and an upper pull. You will see some of these numbers get up into the 100s. I typically see a lot of those purely for the fact that we do the testing unilaterally in a split stance. So we're actually encouraging the athletes to get some rotational capabilities with it, because we want to try to get some insight into full body power production with those specific movements. And then you have a lower body unilateral to your bilateral or vertical jump. So we're comparing a lateral Haydn and a vertical jump on those movements. And if you end up having a guy that's very low on this, say for example in like the 60th percentile, they're showing that they lack the ability to produce comparable power to that bilateral variation. So we'll program in more unilateral split stance variations, rear foot elevated type movements to try to bring that score up in between. All right, so let's move over to an actual example of the general power test. So in this example, you can see how all the actual components of the breakdown that we just looked at are encompassed on that front page. At the top of the page, you're actually going to have your name of your athlete, position, their weight, and so on and so forth. You then have this filter system, which is also over here on the side. We'll play around with that in a moment. You got that Proteus score, the power balance, and then the sections with the pictures and everything that we just looked at. This is all email or able to be emailed or printed out. A lot of the other sites will actually, do this and keep track of how their athletes are going. They'll use it as justification for, what it is they're looking to do next program. Like, here's where you were, here's where you're going, so on and so forth. This is also just a quick breakdown of a lot of the movements listed above. I know I didn't hit the specific movements that we look at during the test. We're not going to do that for this webinar today. They're all going to be listed in these columns. The test typically takes like 3 to 5 minutes to complete. And then you have your stats and your definitions of the things listed below. So this athlete is actually an example of me a couple of months ago. So if we were to pick myself apart just a tad, I mean, the first thing that jumps out is obviously this huge imbalance on that left and right for the right-sided unilateral row. So how would we even look at this from like the training perspective? Like we kind of talked about previously, you want to look at your percentile rankings. You get a quick color percentile. This is comparing me against 13 to 30-year-olds that have completed this test at the same 12-pound resistance, which is what the test is set at for all these movements. We're in the process of developing some more tests that break it down into various ranges. So you could compare it specifically within different weight ranges. But if I was to scroll over and we want to change some of these filters, maybe just baseball only, we'll raise this up to kind of like a 25 to 30. We'll go 20 to 30. Apply it. And you're going to notice that the shift in the graph changes a decent amount, but the numbers that were within it doesn't change at all. Okay, let's hop back over here for a second. So what's different between the general power test and the Cressey power test? So it also encompasses 17 movements, but where you've built this test out to try to have a little bit more of the performance and understanding of baseball players within the gym. It looks at a lot of the same measures. However, the additions are going to be body region breakdowns, which is this example over here. We don't have the huge body graph that we had before, but we're actually breaking down those to each area of the body, and then you'll get that overall percentile ranking for each of those. You have your power acceleration, which we'll hammer out in just a moment, counter versus non-counter. So we're looking at the ability to produce force with a little bit of, momentum going into a movement, and then a full body transfer. You have the same color coding system with both of these. So the big difference you'll notice, and this is once again a screen grab, is this column right down the middle. On the left side, you're going to have your power. On the right side, you're going to have your acceleration. Many of you probably know your power is your force times velocity, and acceleration is meters per second squared. So we ran a couple of tests back in Massachusetts with some college cohort kids, and we ended up noticing that the acceleration side of these movements and some of the analytics that Proteus would put out had higher correlation with how our athletes produced on the field. So we inevitably wanted to make a test that would, be able to harness some of that and apply it with some of our training in the gym. Hence how we came up with this layout. So you're also going to notice that you have the overall balance, power, and acceleration profile, and then the overall percentile ranking. The power, once again, similar to the body balance we saw in the general, it breaks the body into which side you favor in both of these categories, as well as if we had a scaled out view of the Cressey report, this is going to be a culmination of all the movements completed in the test and where you stack up on these domains. So this is probably one of the biggest areas that we will quickly glance with our athletes, and you'll understand why later when we show you some examples of the bucketing system that we use. So this would be considered a fairly large gap in an athlete that would be, very strong with a little bit of balance of the acceleration. So what is it that we would look at? We would look at each one of these areas down below. We have each of our coaches have something that they look at, specifically to another coach, or something that they've found works for them, or, their philosophy of training, so on and so forth. But in general, if an athlete fits into this overall bucket as being more power versus acceleration bias, the gist of their program is going to incorporate more speed strength work. We typically won't do this like the very first program. We'll use the data from the second Cressey report that they do. So if they've been in here the early off season, their first month is like acquaintance and getting used to, our normal style. And then if they're here and we retest, we'll utilize that data to then build out their next program with the emphasis of whatever these buckets that they fall into. So they're going to have that increased speed strength work. So working lighter resistance, light to heavy resistance, moving on things with more explosiveness, acceleration before increasing the resistance. Vice versa, with someone that's going to have a little bit more acceleration than power, they're going to start more on that, strength speed work from heavier weights down to a little lighter resistance, and choosing heavier weights and increasing the power acceleration at each resistance. I feel like that's pretty straightforward, but it always helps to kind of reiterate, if being strong is the key to being fast, then, how come powerlifters wouldn't be the fastest athletes in the world? I think everybody here kind of knows the difference of that. But it's cool to have Proteus be able to quantify these specific areas and where an athlete falls into these. Typically a strength training or an assessment would incorporate only a few movement patterns, whereas Proteus, you literally could do whatever movement you want. You don't have to just go off the Proteus report to get this data. But for baseball players, like, we've designed this test to look more at the things that are going to be applicable in the gym, and we can help our athletes meet their needs to improve on the field. The other big difference that I stated is the counter versus non-counter variation. So your counter is going to have that preloaded movement similar to a swing, and then the non-counter would be from the dead stop. So your vertical jump with like a pause at the bottom. We typically break this down into the trunk rotation component. So we have that core visual, and then we do a plyo trunk rotation. This is tested on both sides. So you start in the middle, you'll load to one side, and you basically swing the arm around to the other side. And then a straight arm trunk rotation, you're pausing at each end of the rep. As you would imagine, if you have the ability to load and explode, you should produce more power. And in majority of our athletes, we will see an example of that. So in this one, you'll see that they're 14% higher in that counter variation compared to the non-counter variation. If an athlete falls outside of these, we then will kind of the general protocol is, if they're higher 10% counter, we want to incorporate a little bit more of like pause reps. But then again, like, we don't want to try to change an athlete too much if they're already in, a range that we want them to fall within. However, the big time you see issues is when someone is like negatively on the side of being higher on the counter variation. Sorry, did I say that right? Yes. All right. If someone is higher on that non-counter variation, then we really want to try to incorporate some of those springiness movements, energy transfer capabilities. If you have an athlete on the table that's super lax, and they're not able to store as much energy or move the arm as violently, you'll see a huge shift in these, and you'll actually might see more of that towards the counter variation, purely for the fact that they're using that elastic recoil or that amortization phase of plyometrics to create more of the energy. Something else that's hugely important is, once again, this is the percent difference compared to that left or right side. I don't think I said that earlier for the Cressey one. That is listed right here. If there's a huge difference in your core to one side or the other, as you'll see in an example later, that's going to predispose you potentially to a cascade of events or injuries up and down the chain. Now, this is going to be an example of the Cressey Power test. You're going to see how each of these areas now pans out in each of these areas. So you can see that the actual test is a little longer and has a different flow to it. But the flow in regards to each of the sections is basically what we have already discussed. So for this athlete, he's going to be ideal or like a very balanced athlete. In this example, this is a outfielder currently in AAA, and he is a left-handed batter and a right-handed thrower, an extremely good athlete, and one that is able to put up high numbers across the board. Once again, we also have this filter system to the side, and then you're going to get that breakdown for each position. So let's just kind of look through here real quick and just see something that kind of jumps out. We mentioned that he was a right-handed thrower. It doesn't surprise us that he's higher on the D2 flexion on the right. You know, those are types of things that, like, I see it, I understand why it is, and we won't look at it too much. The D2 extension was slightly interesting, but then again, like, he's probably not doing too much on that side since he's dominant on the right with both the lead arm hitting and right-handed throwing. This eccentric thing that you see here, this was something that we put in that we still are kind of like capturing some data for, but at the moment, like for today's presentation, we're not going to hammer on it too much. And then this is a good example. So he's right on the fringe of being outside of that 7%, but you'll notice that it's a huge skew, or not a huge skew, but a moderate deviation to the right with the plyo, which is going to more so resemble a left-handed batter's swing. And whereas he's a little bit more, geared towards the left side of that straight arm straight arm trunk rotation on the left, which is going to be the side that he's rotating into throwing. And typically, he might not have as much of that coil, but there's also a ton of other reasons why that might be. But I would consider this as a good split. He's obviously still very strong on both sides. You see that he also trips this color change in the numbers from like the slide chart, and you can then reference those on the percentile rankings. But he is on that 4% higher counter. Ideally, per a lot of the research that you look, you want to see a 10% higher counter variation over the non-counter. So he's a little under that. However, his power numbers at the 12 pounds that we test at are actually pretty good. I mean, he's in those upper and lower 80s. So like, this is something with him being a, opposite side rotational athlete, it kind of makes sense as why he would fall within these. It would be more concerning with another example that you'll see later as him being really high. This acceleration difference that you see with the straight arm and the plyo trunk rotation, albeit it's high, it's the way that the test is designed and that it's measured. Typically, the straight arm rotation is going to be higher because we're accounting for a little bit more range of motion. But these two numbers here, we're going to say they fall within a normal range. Down below, the full body power report that we look at, this is going to be a rotational shot put. This is typically one of our go-to tests for overall athleticism. If someone is relatively within that 7% on both sides and producing a heck of a lot of power, then we know that they're, typically a good athlete. Where you'll see huge skews are in your younger athletes, ones that, are either motor morons or baby giraffes that, are only good at doing what they're good at. And we'll definitely want to try to shift them to being more balanced across the board. This is where like your multi-sport athletes are going to really excel in, and ones that, have a good awareness for their body movements. And then the down below is very similar to what was in the general power test. And then you have your references and training recommendations. So many of you are probably wondering at the moment, it's like, well, how am I supposed to look at this, digest this data, make a game plan for my athlete, and make sure that I'm doing what's, best for them? I will say the more of these that you have the opportunity to do, you are definitely going to find your go-tos and things that you need to pull information from. Whereas the Proteus software, we're actually working on creating a like AI-driven feature that's going to show you where the common things are and kind of like highlight the go-to information that would be then spit out to you to make those changes or justifications or validations that you need right there on the software versus you going in and digging through it. Let me actually show you one other thing. I wasn't planning on doing this as part of the thing, but I needed to do this as well. So if we also go to the filters, let's just like open these up a lot, or just even take all sports. You're going to notice how these numbers will start to change. And let's just do like males only. If you're working with baseball population, you probably want to compare, these types of athletes to other ones. If we then also go back into some of the other software that Proteus provides, this is something that my colleague Justin did previously, but just so if we got any new people on the call, so they can kind of see some other functions, they can see it in this software side. Sorry, I hit the wrong button. All right, so let's look at this straight arm trunk rotation for that exact same athlete. You're going to get the breakdown of a lot of the movements and metrics that we just looked at. However, you also can go into the software and look at some other things, consistency, velocity, range of motion, which is actually an interesting with some T-spine rotation clients. With this specific athlete, like he needs to complete a couple more training sessions to have trend lines. Don't worry, I'll show those shortly. And then you can look at a 3D movement for the test that he did. And you can kind of see where he is within like the 3D space for his left and his right side. So this side, now that right side would be mimicking more of his left-handed swing into right rotation, if that makes sense. All right, let's get back over here. Doing good on time. I'm gonna try to wrap this up in the next like 10-ish minutes so that we can cover any questions. So these are going to be some examples. This is an athlete that spent this past offseason with us. He's been with us for a couple of years. He came off the season. We got our initial baseline data on 10/26, and then he actually had a test in between this, and then his second test on December 9th. And very quickly, if you look at these percentile changes, he had significant improvements between the two tests. You then would be able to look at that up underneath. You also see he had some changes in the acceleration here. If there is a movement that they, outperform on in some areas, like that will change some of these up here, which is why I really like to stack these tests on top of each other, like over a couple of months, just because you're going to be able to, get a better sense of where this athlete falls within. So our goals, obviously, with this athlete at the beginning of the offseason, we're going to be to improve his power and maybe slightly gain some acceleration. But we first need to get him back to a state of symmetry after the long season. As a pitcher, threw close to 130 innings. So he needed a month to kind of get his feet wet back in the gym before we started to push him a little bit. I could even pull up his test following this so that you could see this next little jump that he had. But let's kind of move along a little bit, and I'll save some of these other specific things for some of the questions. But this would be what we would sit down and talk with the athlete on what their goals were, like where they struggled through the season, like where their weaknesses happened, did they have any injuries, so on and so forth. And then we'll, look at these over the course of time, typically the full off season before sitting down with them again, or use the justification of what we're doing with their program, like I've said a couple of times. So in this example, this is actually one of the cooler examples that I didn't necessarily even find as a coach, but one of my athletes who showed this example found out on his own while he was in the batting cage after a session one day. So it's okay to be different. Like we talked about, these norms we want to fit within. However, this athlete showed that basically an even split between that counter and the non-counter variation. He's a hitter that was a free agent at the beginning of the year. His tendency over his career was he was a low batting average guy, had a lot of power, but had a high strikeout rate as well. He's worked with hitting coaches. They've all tried to get him to shorten up his load phase, but he always thought that he didn't want to compromise power for a little bit better contact in today's game. We ran through the test. I was breaking down the report kind of like how I've done in this, and he pointed out to me, he's like, well, I don't really have much difference between that plyo trunk rotation and that straight arm trunk rotation. Like maybe some of the things that like my hitting coaches have been kind of telling me, I could try to look into it a little bit more. So he connected the dots for himself of, hey, maybe let me cut down on this extra leg kick, like the head bobbing up and down. Like, let me stop trying to create all this extra load when I can just start from a state of position that I'm already very, very strong at. He ended up making this change. He ended up getting picked up by a minor league affiliate, and now he's already climbed up into AAA over the course of this season with some simple little cueing or a pickup that he made on his own that now, since seeing some of these results with some of the guys, like we've started making slight modifications with, our pitchers, our hitters, or so on and so forth, just with, seeing some of these numbers play out longitudinally over time. So this cannot be done, though, without understanding your athlete's injury history, table assessment, movement qualities, and their sport-specific demand. I can't overreiterate how important that is, that, this is just a piece of the pie. So this next example is being able to catch something before it happens and preventative measures. So I think this is something that's ultra important, especially, or needs to be ultra important in today's game. You have so much like money tied up on the IL with musculoskeletal injuries that, presumably could be avoided if you just look in the right place. So we see a huge imbalance of that plyo trunk rotation, or just trunk rotation in general, towards the right side. This is an example of a left-handed batter and a right-handed thrower, and the guy had a right oblique injury not even a month after taking this test. Once again, like, it's something that in the moment we could say like, oh, how much does it really matter? Well, I wish I could go back and catch this, but since before it happened, he ended up missing a good chunk of the season because he, falls so far out. Typically, we would want to see a norm difference of that 6 to 7, kind of like what we discussed earlier. But hindsight's always going to be 2020, obviously. But it's something to keep an eye out. There's definitely been some other ones that we've potentially saved. I guess there's no way of ever knowing if we save one, but we are definitely trying to keep our players on the field. We don't want to set them up for success by running them into their strengths more so. So as a right oblique, he did it hitting as a right-handed batter. So that is going to be a right internal oblique strength. Next is an example of the trend lines. This was shown in the 3D graph area where you have all your different power, acceleration, and those things like breaking down, where I was scrolling down from the software side. And this is going to be something that you can track out over time. So in the past, during the midst of the off season, we'll try to run some of our athletes through a daily test or a weekly test. So we get these little plots on the graph of where they're trending. So that way we know when to push them, when to take it easy, when to, like scale back from power development into gym, transition more into like your skill-based stuff, so on and so forth. Benchmark testing, once again, you're, getting a larger sample size of average range for an athlete before, something goes wrong. At least you know where to work back to. And then injury tracking progressions. This is an interesting line to follow following a surgery, and one that we actually used a lot with Verlander during the course of his rehab on that right arm, is tracking that over the course of like an 8-month period and working up to where he was pre-throwing. And one of my best examples of this, unfortunately, coming out of the era of COVID, we got hit pretty hard last year in the gym. Interestingly enough, we had a lot of intake data for our guys at the beginning of the off season, and we went back and looked at this following a stint of COVID. And like this example up here in the top is actually one of the athletes. He's just cruising along and then plummets off for a good month and a half or so following a serious bout with COVID that he had. I think obviously this is an important data point to use on various athletes, especially when we're doing a lot of our throwing and guys have pre-planned days that are going to be high throwing or low throwing, to just get like a quick reading on and make sure that they're able to push things that day versus maybe they should take a little day off. We also have like the Whoop band and the Oura rings now, a day to track some of those other variables of sleep and recovery. Kind of summarizing some things up, I talked about that bucketing system earlier. This video that's over here on the right, this is actually a video that Eric made. It's going to run 25 minutes or so, and he's going to break down each one of these bucketing systems a little thoroughly. This is also made like close to 10 or 11 months ago, so some of that color scheme that I mentioned with the Power Reports has changed since this video was made, but the data that's in the video has not changed whatsoever. So an athlete comes in, we run them through the test. We typically will just, in our head or with the co-assigning coach that's working with the athlete, will work together to put the athlete within these buckets. So you have your baseline or ideal athlete. They possess both the strong base and power and acceleration with no glaring holes or asymmetries within that report. This would be an example of that outfielder that we looked at that had the high scores in both areas. You're then going to have your strong athlete. So they have the high power or a low acceleration. This is going to be one where we're definitely going to want to try to like flip the script just a tad. This is the part that makes things so much different, is you have to know the athlete. You can't just, whimsily go in and make the changes without knowing what the athlete's goals are or their personality or so on and so forth. But when you get one that matches up, boy, does it like really create like the perfect storm in getting the results that you're looking for as a coach. You have your weak athlete, they're low across the board. Typically your younger athletes are going to be in this area. Main goal is let's just get them strong. Your elastic athlete, high counter versus the non-counter scores that we look at with the truck rotation, typically going to be a little bit more of those lax guys that we find on the table, better at storing some of that energy and using it as that slingshot. And then your asymmetrical guys, you'd be surprised there's some healthy guys walking around with some huge asymmetries, both from the power standpoint, but then also just like their postural presentation. We'll use that to then correspond to try to get them to like fall within another one of these buckets. Proteus provides that piece of the pie that's going to be more of the power side. You have to have the comprehensive understanding of your athlete, their goals, their table findings, the movement qualities, their specific position. But what we do mostly with the report is going to be the key takeaways and how we do rep ranges with our athletes. Are we looking to, be more within that strength power side? Are we looking to do lighter weight, faster with velocity-based measures? Not only with Proteus as the training tool, but also in the gym. How many sets we're looking to do with guys. We can also look at some endurance measures to see if we would want to push them a little bit more. A big one is obviously tempo for both the upper and the lower. Clustering. So that's going to be, going back and forth between common movements in the gym and common comparable movements on Proteus. A lot of those are going to be like med ball variations, because you can load it up much heavier on Proteus without the effects of gravity on the med ball weighing you down. Since training, plane or power is plane specific, Proteus is one of the only tools that we have the ability to actually utilize strength training within a rotational plane or a functional movement pattern that's applicable to the athlete and the movement that they want to complete. And then post-activation potentiation, or whatever fits the athlete's needs. So we have a ton of guys that really like using Proteus as a throwing or like a pre-hitting routine. It's an interjection or a shot into the central nervous system of feedback on where their body is in space and so on and so forth. And guys really love it. And it actually makes a huge difference subjectively just feeling it yourself. This is the link to that video. Feel free to take a video. You're obviously going to have the recording of this as well. So you can go back and watch this at your own leisure. So I'm going to scale this back for a second and try to figure out how to get everything back to where I can see you guys. Where's the... All right. I'm going to bring this back up in just a second. But I'm going to open up the floor for some questions if anybody has some, and then I'm going to put another screen back up there for you guys. So feel free to drop something in the chat or hop on the camera, undo your audio. I'm going to put my email and everything up here as well. There we go. All right.
Tanner, I know historically force plates have been used for like lower extremity. Would this be comparable for the upper extremity, or would that be a big jump, or is that realistic?
Yeah, so I think that is honestly one of the better comparisons. The Proteus can be, you know, a force plate for the upper extremity, like you mentioned. As a comparison real quick, we are in the process of doing some third-party testing with force plates and like a lower extremity testing on Proteus. However, we have done some validation for velocity-based metrics with upper body movements on Proteus, and the correlation is actually very high. Since you have the ability to actually train or measure these movements comparable to like an accelerometer and a med ball for like a force plate for your upper extremity, the way that Proteus is set up where the machine provides the resistance and you have to overcome it is definitely going to be very comparable to what you mentioned. And I see Tony has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. What was the discrepancy between the overall acceleration and the power? Was there that was alarming to you, or when was it a red flag when you saw one greater than the other?
You're talking about for a specific movement or overall?
Overall.
If it falls outside about 15%, like we're gonna start to wonder, like, how are you gonna be powerful but not have the ability to also accelerate? But typically, like, I will use the data as it is up front and we'll test it again next month to see what changes. A lot of times, the first time someone uses Proteus, there is some like novelty to getting used to a new machine. So my second test onward is going to be highly telling of where those areas are or the gap between. But if a guy is powerful and they have a 15% gap or 20% gap in the acceleration, like, I take it for what it's worth. Like, you showed me that you're stronger than you are accelerating. Like, let's change a couple of things in the gym to try to shorten that gap. Obviously, guys that are going to be more powerful, they're going to lack some of that explosiveness. So you might actually want that depending on your position. So we have offensive linemen that are going to blow out the house with the power production, whereas we might have, you know, a smaller athlete that he needs to rely more on his agility and speed to create some whippiness power. So we're going to want to have that a little bit closer. So it all is dependent on the athlete. The thing that I think you as like the clinician or the coach needs to notice is that there is a difference there. They're a unique individual. Like, what makes them unique? Let me understand you a little bit better by having this piece to the pie. And then I can help program to what you as an athlete need for your specific sport.
Okay, thank you.
And let's see. So I know a lot of people are using this to get that recording, which I don't blame them. I mean, we're right here in the middle of the day. I'm sitting in the office at CSP. We got the music blaring. I know I'll probably hopefully get some emails. Like I said, this is kind of a moderate or a medium style presentation. I could probably do another hour presentation just looking at the examples of those buckets with the training periodization that would follow. Do we have any people in here that are currently using Proteus that would like to also chime in on how they use tests, or any people that are interested in getting a Proteus maybe that would like to have some other questions answered? I'll give it a little bit longer. I do appreciate you guys coming and doing the live session though. Lena, what are y'all using? Oh, there we go. Hey, Lena.
Sorry if the music is loud on my end. I'm in the gym too, but actually we are using the Proteus, and we actually have a couple of our high school, he's a senior, he's actually a switch hitter, so righty and lefty, and we went and did the Proteus test just to see how far off of his measurement. So that's a really good thing to have, honestly. Obviously, we want him to be at a similar, there are going to be some difference in the measurements, but we would like to see, it not to be so far off. So that's what we've been using the Proteus test for, just to see how he's doing and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's great. I definitely appreciate you chiming in on that. There's another thought that came to mind with that. Obviously, these elite level athletes that we work with, here at CSP, before this, there was no way to justify how these athletes would fall within these bucketing systems. So over this past 2-year period, like, we've been collecting data, we've been trying to run regressions on this data and actually find out, like, hey, where's the norm at? Like, what are we wanting to have these elite athletes fall into? And I will say, like, heading into this upcoming offseason, some of those normative datas that we've collected over the past 2 years, we have much better sense of what that needs to be, especially within the baseball population. I can only speak to the baseball side more confidently, obviously, but those 7% ranges with some of your throwers, you might actually see that to an opposite side that you would expect. So a quick example of this would be if you have a right-handed thrower and you test them on Proteus, what you'll typically see is that they're going to have higher power productions into right rotation. As a physical therapist, it makes a ton of sense to me, because you're getting the eccentric overload or the eccentric deceleration stress on that right side, which then when you put them in a start position on their left side and have them do an explosive movement from a dead stop, they're typically going to be a little stronger. This is something that, you wouldn't be able to have measured before Proteus, because you would use a cable machine and maybe just rack up a bunch of weight and see who was stronger moving with a cable wood chop. So we've actually seen some good skews to that dominant or to the non-dominant side in the way that Proteus collects the data. And this has both been, oddly enough, for some left-handed pitchers and right-handed pitchers. Whether or not those are going to lead to an inherent risk later on, similar to what I mentioned with that oblique injury guy. We haven't seen any. The cool thing with us also is that we have, close to 200 professional / semi-pro athletes that train here that have done the test on Proteus. So we have a ton of data that backlogs over the past year. We keep up with all our athletes. We see how their seasons are going. We are, going back and looking at things, if they have any injuries, to see where things, stand out and where we need to develop more on the software side, or as coaches to try to catch things earlier to bring the best service to our athletes. And I think that's the next step for Proteus, with kind of the software adapting to the amount of input that we've been able to collect over this, time period. Sorry, I rambled on a little bit, Lena, but good point.
Quick question, Tanner.
Yeah, absolutely, Isaiah.
So I work here. I'm an instructor here at the Texas Baseball Ranch, and we've had an athlete that we've had for a couple years, and he moves very well. He's a smaller athlete. He's a pitcher. Moves very well, like in our strength and conditioning routines. His movement patterns, they aren't like so far off to where anything's very alarming. But he doesn't have any, his velocity isn't very high. It's pretty below average, you can say. So if you were to, I would have tested to maybe his power, but we've never had him on this Proteus motion. We've never tested him before. But would you say like the only success is if we test him, and then let's say we test him once this month, and the next month we test him and he increases, like he gets better at that, but the velocity doesn't increase? Would you attest that to, just power? Would you have to see the athlete yourself, or how would you go?
No, this is a great point, and one that we've asked ourselves. So first off, obviously the age of the athlete is going to play a huge role in this, the movement quality side of things. If an athlete is showing the qualities that you mentioned, you ran him through the test and nothing potentially like showed up with like the glaring hole. It seems like what you're saying though is he would probably score well on the power, but he would lack on the acceleration, correct?
Maybe the opposite. Maybe
the opposite. So be a little faster, but not as powerful.
Mhm.
So yeah, great example. We've actually done some studies looking at the acceleration side of things with pitching velocity. So if a guy has higher acceleration on the dominant side with a couple of the movements that we would ideally look at, obviously like D2 flexion, that left-sided or right-sided trunk rotation, their lateral bound, the ability to get off of that right leg with some explosiveness, and then use that on like a Rapsodo or with a Rapsodo to see where they kind of fall into. We would build the training program out to fit the needs that we're looking to improve. Or for this athlete, it's hard to kind of make up generalizations with them. So I'm trying to come up something real quick to kind of show you as a comparison. But how old did you say this guy is? Sorry.
He's 18. He's 18 or 19. He's going into his freshman year of college.
Gotcha. Our table assessment, I think it's important to not just put all your eggs in like the Proteus basket, but our table assessment is going to encompass like every region of the body. I know you guys at Texas Baseball Ranch do that as well. And then you're going to compare that piece of the pie with Proteus. If you have like an aha moment and you see like, well, this guy is lacking the ability to transfer force through his core, that might be his missing link, that he's not connecting the lower extremities to the upper extremities. He might also have like an inability to create rotational power through his left-sided row if he's a right-handed pitcher. So kind of that glove side tuck. I mean, he could get stuck in his right hip and not be as good at exploding as he is out of his left. If he falls within a huge PRI, left AIC type pattern, huge asymmetries. Typically, we have seen those kind of show up on the power production with the power test, albeit a little small. Your posture and then obviously your dynamic movement side of things are going to be different since we're, constantly flowing. But like you mentioned, it would have to be what's the athlete in front of you? Where are your abilities as a coach to help the athlete? Test and retest. That's the big thing. Yeah, I would, if you email me, if you have that direct thing, if you have any information like on that kid, I can definitely potentially try to help for an example like that, just because I do it in person. So it's much easier, obviously, when they're in front of you to like look at things. So it could just be, mechanical, honestly. The Proteus isn't going to help on that side as much, obviously, as well.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, we're coming up right at 2. We'll give it like 30 more seconds. I am available for the email. We are going to be sending this out as a recording at some point. I'll check with the Proteus team on when that's happening. We got anything else, guys? All right. Well, I enjoyed all you guys taking the time to come sit with me during the lunch hour today. Hope you guys have a great rest of your evenings. And hopefully I'll be giving another presentation soon. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks.